Why is it that so many of us are confident in our studying ability, despite the fact that so few of us have ever actually learned how to study properly? Well, part of that has to do with those standardized assessments. Remember, the assessments were created to be relatively difficult for a group of students that never learned how to study. So if you do well in those, you might think that you're pretty good. And some of you really will be. But really, you're only good compared to a group of students that don't know how to study. If you were to compare yourself to your own learning potential, you'd realize that you're underutilizing that potential and using only a very small percentage of your brain's capacity to learn. In fact, when we do in-depth evaluations more formally, looking at the efficiency of students compared to the research and what that tells us about how their brain can work, we find that most students are 50% or below in their studying efficiency, with most students actually hovering around 20% of their academic potential. What that means is that for you, the good news is that it's viable that you could double, triple, or quadruple your studying efficiency, which means that you could be spending half or a third or a quarter of the time studying to get the same result or better, right? So it seems a little bit unbelievable, and you may be skeptical, and I can understand where you're coming from. I'd be skeptical if I was in your position as well. Having said that, think about a professional athlete. Do you think it's viable that a professional athlete who is professionally trained could be 2, 3, or 4 times better than an amateur who's only been playing around with their friends? Probably the answer is yes. So when we compare it that way, it's very clear that someone that's had proper training is vastly superior to someone that hasn't had proper training. So remember, it's a skill just like any other. And if we haven't learned the proper technique, there's no real reason for us to believe that we would be that good at it. But there's another component to this overconfidence, and that it's actually a bit of a human tendency. So, in fact, this is so widely seen as a phenomenon of human psychology that it even has its own name. If you were to ask drivers on the road, how good their driving skill is, 90% of drivers would say that they're an above average driver. 94% of college professors believe that they're an above average teacher. So obviously that doesn't mathematically make sense. So there's a fundamental aspect of human psychology that's at play here that causes us to generally believe that we're overconfident. And we're not just overconfident about everything, we're overconfident about the things that we tend not to have a lot of knowledge about. When we have a little bit of information about it, we tend to be overconfident. So most of us, we've learned a little bit about driving, but compared to everything that there is to know about driving, a stunt car driver reversing at 100 kilometers an hour down a cliff, doing a J-turn and drifting around a corner, most of us can't do that. So our knowledge on driving is limited a little bit. And the rest of it is just time that we've had to experience our limited knowledge and practice. And so it gives us a false sense of security and thinking that we're a better driver than we actually are. Same thing with professors, even though that being a professor, educating is their job, they're not actually comparing each other on their teaching ability. They're normally comparing themselves based on their expertise in the field that they're teaching. So even though a professor, their job is to educate, relative to the amount of educational training that they've received, their field expertise is a lot greater. So a professor of microbiology is going to be usually in the top tier of knowledge when it comes to microbiology. But when it comes to actual teaching, their level of training is usually not that high. So this phenomenon, which is so common, is actually called the Dunning-Kruger effect. So this graph here is a graph of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it's called the Dunning-Kruger graph. The yellow line in the y-axis represents confidence, while the x-axis represents knowledge. So what we can see is that the knowledge is the highest at 2 points, here and here. But they are on very different aspects of the graph. So while maximum confidence occurs here and then here, the amount of knowledge that they have at the time is very, very different, as you can see. So what this is really telling us is that when we first learn something, we are gaining knowledge very quickly. So relative to what we used to know, so for example, right here at the beginning, 0, 0, 0 knowledge, 0 confidence. That's like me saying, hey, how confident are you at building me a rocket ship that will send me to Mars? You'd probably say, you know, Justin, I'm probably not so confident because you're not a rocket scientist and you're not Elon Musk. So as a result, your confidence will be low because your knowledge is very low. Basically, no knowledge. But when you learn a little bit, your confidence increases because relative to nothing, you now know a lot. You learn a little bit more, and then you've doubled your knowledge. A little bit more, you've tripled your knowledge. So it's very easy to take leaps and bounds in knowledge relative to what you already knew because of the fact that you knew so little. If you have 1 grain of rice and I give you 2 grains of rice, you've doubled your grains of rice, but you still only have 2 grains of rice. So the confidence goes up very, very quickly in the initial parts of the knowledge. And this peak that's reached right here is actually given a very scientific name, and this is genuinely the very formal, real-life name that's given to this point on the graph. And this point on the graph is called Mount Stupid. Yes, that's really the name. So people at the top of Mount Stupid, these are like your anti-vaxxers. These are the people that know a very, very small amount about science or immunology, and they have a very high level of confidence because compared to what they used to know, which was almost nothing, they think that they know a lot. After we learn a little bit more, our confidence starts to go down because now we realize that there is so much more to know. So this might be familiar to you with Maslow's hierarchy of competence, where at the beginning, we're unconsciously incompetent. We know so little that we don't even know what we don't know. When we're at the bottom here and we're feeling like our confidence is really low, that means that we know enough to realize that we don't know a lot. And this is actually called the Valley of Despair. And this is often where a lot of PhD students will end up being. So the time scale here is important to realize is that from here to here is we're looking at years worth of knowledge. And after accumulating knowledge for years, we realize, you know, there's a lot we don't know. I've been learning for years and still there's a lifetime of knowledge that I'll never be able to cover. And then as we go, we gain more and more knowledge, slowly accumulating it to the point where we truly are an expert and our confidence is well deserved. This slope is actually called the slope of enlightenment. And to get to this point here, we're really looking at decades of years, okay? So tens of years spent to get to that point where our knowledge truly should be as confident as it was 6 months or 1 year into learning about this. So this is a very widely seen phenomenon, and it shows that there is a way that we can calibrate our level of confidence based on just objectively assessing how much knowledge we have. So if your confidence about studying is really high, but the only amount of actual training you've received in studying is from talking to your friends, watching some YouTube videos, and reading some articles, your confidence may be the studying equivalent of being an anti-vaxxer. And no one wants to be in anything equivalent of being an anti-vaxxer. So what you really need to think about is, in what ways am I on Mount Stupid? In what ways am I unnecessarily confident? In what ways am I confident without having any real expertise to back it up? So often we think we've spent years studying, and I've spent years kind of experimenting with things. But actually, if you go through a formal course and are formally trained for a period of years, and then you dive into the research and you look at that for years and you experiment thousands of times every single year on different iterations and combinations, and a decade later, you come out the other end feeling like you really truly understand what it is to learn effectively, then you can have a 9 or 10 9 or 10 out of 10 confidence about studying and learning. But if all you've done is just kind of have chats here and there and read some articles and watch some YouTube, then probably your level of knowledge on the subject is very, very, very small. Probably so basic that there isn't even any modern research on it because of the fact that it's all old news. So, in that case, you may actually be on Mount Stupid. And it's not a bad thing because it means that you realize where you are and it allows you to taper and calibrate yourself. There's always aspects that we're going to be confident about, but if we're aware of what we shouldn't be so confident about, it opens our mind to accepting new information and advice and actually trying new things because now we're not so, to put it bluntly, we're not so full of ourselves. And if I had realized this earlier on, I probably would have saved 6 or 7 years of my personal development just by getting out of my own way. So trust me, I was on Mount Stupid for longer than probably all of you. And for me, just to give you a reference, I've been at this point, I've been learning about this type of thing casually and then formally trained and then really intensively looking at the research and reading through thousands of articles and experimenting really vigorously in my own life, as well as teaching students about this for several years now. So I would say that I've got about 10 or just over 10 years of pretty intensive experience just learning about this. I would say that I'm around here at the moment. I think that I'm around here. And I definitely remember the point when I was down here. And I definitely remember in my final years of high school, early years of university, when I thought I was up here. And let me tell you that I was vastly mistaken. And the techniques that I'm going to teach you throughout this course are the things that I learned after I came down from Mount Stupid. These are the things that 90% at the underneath the water that make up the bulk of the iceberg that actually make that meaningful difference.